Hi, everyone. Welcome to Education for Flourishing, Pursuing Purpose in the Professions. This is our first monthly Virtues and Vocations webinar of the year. This webinar is part of the Virtues and Vocations Initiative, a national forum housed at the Center for Social Concerns at the University of Notre Dame for scholars and practitioners across disciplines to consider how best to cultivate character in pre-professional and professional education. This initiative is funded through a generous gift from the Kern Family Foundation. I am Suzanne Shanahan, and I direct the Center for Social Concerns and am host for this particular series. At any point during the program, you can submit questions using the Q&A function in Zoom, and we will return to those questions around 12:40. Be assured that there is a backstage team that will quickly jump in to address any technical difficulties that might arise. And with that, today we are thrilled to welcome University of Virginia President James Ryan to discuss character, higher education, and democracy. James has served as the 9th president of the University of Virginia since 2018. An elected member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and a leading expert on law and education, Ryan has written extensively about the ways in which legal structures intersect with educational opportunity. His articles and essays address such topics as school desegregation, school finance, school choice, and the intersection of special education and neuroscience. He is also the author of the textbook, Educational Policy and Law, and the author of 5 Miles Away, A World Apart, and Wait What? And Life's Other Essential Questions, based on his viral Harvard commencement speech. Before coming to UVA to serve as president, Ryan served as the Charles William Eliot Professor and Dean of the Harvard Graduate School of Education. Before this deanship, Ryan was the Matheson and Morgenthau Distinguished Professor at the University of Virginia School of Law. He has also served as academic dean from 2005 to 2009 and founded and directed the law school's program in law and public service. He is a first-generation college student who received his AB in American Studies from Yale University and his JD from the University of Virginia. He is also an avid runner and has completed 11 Boston marathons. Welcome, Jim.
Suzanne, thanks very much for that kind introduction and for hosting me today.
Yeah, that's wonderful to have you here. I confess I'm a longtime fan, having read 5 Miles Apart when it first came out. So thrilled to get to have the chance to have a conversation with you these many years later. So,
well, you're one of only a dozen people who have read that book, so I'm really glad to have the chance to talk with you.
Great. So today, as we discussed, I'm hoping to have a fairly open-ended conversation about your work, how you think about your work, where you hope to be going next,
Sure.
both in your own scholarship, but also at UVA.
Yeah.
I think we also, given that you became president not long before COVID, might talk a little bit about how that has or has not affected your work and thinking as a university of president. So
Okay.
it may be a topic you are well tired of.
We could spend a long time talking about that.
So just to kind of open it up a bit, one of the things that I found most striking in your viral Harvard commencement speech is you're really candid about your personhood, your values, your beliefs, and your aspirations, and how they intersect with the way you think about your own work. Can you share a little bit about your own personal trajectory from being a first-gen student at Yale to pursuing a law degree, ending up in academic law, and a variety of different leadership positions in universities?
Sure. You know, in some ways, it's a lot of it has been a bit accidental, but in some ways there's a through line. And so let me try to talk about both just briefly. I was a first generation college student, as you mentioned, and went to Yale as an undergraduate. And, the experience completely changed my life, and opened up doors that I didn't even know existed. It also got me realizing that the education system really worked for me the way we imagine our public education system working. I went to public schools in my small hometown of Midland Park and got a really good education, had teachers who cared about me, and then was the first in my family to go to college. And it got me thinking at that point, why did the system work for me when it hasn't worked for so many others? And I carried that question with me to law school. And I had always imagined being a civil rights lawyer and thought I would focus my attention on education and educational opportunity and inequity. And then had a law school professor who I wrote a paper for in my third year of law school who said you should think about being a law professor, which I'd never really thought about, but thought more and more about it and was attracted to the idea that you could have one foot in the so-called real world and one foot in the academy and teach and write and be involved with issues around educational opportunity. And so that's how I ended up as a law professor. And I expected that's what I would do for the rest of my life. I remember, people would ask me when I was in my 6th or 7th year of being a law professor, what are you going to do next? And I would say, well, I would imagine in 30 or 40 years, I'll retire. I never imagined going into higher ed administration work. And I knew I didn't want to be a dean of a law school, just because I liked being a law professor more. And then I got an opportunity out of the blue, really, to be the dean of the Harvard Graduate School of Education. And I was attracted to the job because I was so interested in this topic of educational opportunity. And I thought I would have more of an impact doing that than I would as a solo law professor. And then the opportunity, and I didn't go to become a dean thinking that I would be a university president. The thought never entered my mind. And I was really enjoying the work. I love the Harvard Graduate School of Education because it's so mission driven. Everyone there is there because they care about education and want to either expand opportunity or improve outcomes. But then I got a call from UVA, also a bit out of the blue. And this institution has meant a lot to me. I was here as a law student. I was hired as a law professor. My wife, Katie, and I have 4 kids, and they mostly grew up in Charlottesville. And it was right around the time of the white supremacist rally in Charlottesville. And it just felt like it was an opportunity to come back and serve.
From the outside, it looks as if this through line is a bit of calling for you in terms of this interest in why education doesn't serve all students the way it served you, why it doesn't provide that kind of educational opportunity. While you can narrate that looking back, do you think in real time that was an ongoing motivation for you?
Yeah,
Work?
yeah, absolutely. I mean, the question itself has been one that has animated basically everything I've done as a professional. I could not have foreseen or predicted that my professional life would take the turns that it has. But the reason for any job I've taken in some ways goes back to that question of how do we improve our education system, whether it's pre-K, elementary, middle, or high school, or higher education. And it's made me realize that when I talk to my own kids or when I talk to students, I always suggest that they should really try to identify the issue or topic that they're really passionate about, and worry less about the actual job that they're going to have, as long as it allows them to pursue that interest or passion. Because I think at the end of the day, it's more important that you have an answer not to what do you do, which is what everyone asks each other, but why do you do it? And if you have a good answer to why you do what you do, one that satisfies yourself, I think you're likely to have more satisfaction in your career than if you're just able to say what you do without being able to really explain why.
Great. I think when many people listen to your Harvard commencement address, it's they think to themselves, "Wow, this is a very good human." And I think that that really sort of comes out front and center in that, because you really describe a very compelling way of being in the world. Um, and I'm just wondering, sort of in your role as UVA president, is that goodness harder or easier to put in practice than it might have been as dean of the Graduate School of Education or as a law professor? Um, are there challenges that mitigate that kind of thoroughgoing attempt at goodness?
That's a really interesting question. I think that the reality is that the larger the institution and the larger your role, the more complicated it is, only because more people know of you, but fewer people know you.
Mhm.
And so it just makes things harder to accomplish, not because there's necessarily any opposition, but just because the sheer scope of the organization makes the challenge a little bit harder. But I would say the flip side of that is that your impact can be much greater. And so I think it's worth the added complexity. And, you know, I think a lot of these jobs are really exercises in change management. No institution that is worth its salt stands still. So every institution is constantly evolving. And the question is, how much direction can you provide to the institution itself? And then what's the best way of doing that? But I also think that, you know, in these jobs, you have to articulate a vision for any place. And, you know, the one that we settled on here pretty early on in my presidency was a university that's not just great, but also good. And I've been really pleasantly surprised by how much that's resonated, and felt like it tapped into something that was already true about this place, but also tapped into an aspiration for the place.
Great. Maybe we can talk a little bit about that strategic plan,
Sure.
great and good. You note that in the plan, we should strive not simply to be great, but also to be good, recognizing that in the not too distant future, it will be likely be impossible for a university to be truly great if it is not also good. The very best faculty, students, and staff are going to want to live and work and study at institutions in which they can believe wholeheartedly, institutions that are both outstanding and ethical, institutions that are excellent, but excellent for a purpose. So how did you come on to this way of articulating a vision for UVA?
I spent a lot of time listening to people, honestly. It took us about a year to put the strategic plan together. You know, I had spent 3 years here as a law student and then 15 years on the faculty. So I wasn't coming in completely a complete novice to UVA. And I thought that it took us a little while to articulate all of that, obviously, and to capture it. But the spirit was there all along. And in some respects, I saw our task in creating the strategic plan as figuring out the best way to help UVA become the very best version of itself, not a way to turn it into a completely different university, because I thought then, and I still think now, that the foundations of this place and the values of this place are outstanding. And the real question is, how do you close the gap between your aspirations and values and the lived reality, a gap that exists in every organization. And so capturing the idea of great and good was in some respect a reflection of the hundreds of hours of conversations I had with students, faculty, and staff, and the hundreds of hours that those who were helping me on the plan had, and trying to do that in a pithy way that people could actually remember, became the challenge. But once I still remember I was on a plane with the law school dean and sort of running through possible taglines for the strategic plan. And I won't bore you with the ones that were left on the cutting room floor. But I said, part of me feels like what we're really trying to do, and I think what is both the smart and the right thing to do for this university, is to just embrace the idea that we're trying to not just be great, but also good. And Risa Goluboff, who is the dean of the law school, said, well, why don't you just say that? And that was that.
So a couple of things about this particular plan and vision. If you were to say, what are the 3 things you're trying to do to make that happen, the 3 most important? I know it's a multidimensional plan, but from your perspective, or the 3 first critical steps?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I would identify a few things that are really key. The first is, broadly speaking, to really take advantage of the diversity that exists at a university, including UVA. And by taking advantage of the diversity, I mean allowing our students, I'll just talk about students for now, the opportunity to get to know one another, and to take advantage of the fact that they'll have the chance to meet people here who they probably never would have crossed paths with otherwise. So some of the things that we're doing to ensure that happens is working to provide housing for, we call freshmen first years and sophomore second years. There's some unique lingo at UVA, as you may know, to provide housing for first and second years. Because right now, when first years arrive, they're often told that they need to find a lease for an apartment for the following year, sometime in September or October, which doesn't give them a lot of time to meet new friends. And so I think housing students for the first couple of years would go a long way to easing the pressure to find a roommate for your second year, but also give them the opportunity to explore. The second is one of the goals is to make UVA synonymous with service. And so one of the things that we're doing is creating a series of public service pathways for students who are interested in public service, regardless of their career. It's not necessarily designed just for students who know they're going to do public interest work or work for the government or work for a nonprofit, but how are they going to, throughout the course of their lifetimes, be engaged in public service in one form or another. And then the third thing I would say is being a university that lives its values. So not just talking about and teaching about equity, not just talking or teaching about sustainability, not just talking and teaching about what it means to be an anchor institution, but actually doing all of those things as an institution. I mean, I think one of the things that people sometimes forget is that universities are not just places where students come to learn and faculty come to teach and to do research, or if you have a medical center where people come for medical care, but we're really large organizations that have an impact on our community. And so one of the highest priorities I've had is to try to make our relationship with the surrounding community, city of Charlottesville, Albemarle County, as strong as it can possibly be, taking seriously the idea that in Charlottesville, we are the anchor institution.
Great. So as you lay this out, all makes sense, consistent with great and good. Were there stakeholders at UVA, it's a state institution, who were like, ooh, Not sure.
Uh, No, there weren't really. I mean, I think some people might have, tinkered with it a bit more or put emphasis on one thing rather than another. I think there have been sometimes some pushback on the idea of being good, and some question of, what do you mean exactly? Is that, some vehicle for some radical left-wing agenda? What are you really up to? I mean, that's just the nature of the game these days. And so some of it just requires repeating over and again what exactly you mean by it. And I think it's a set of values that are widely shared. So some of it is just reminding people what your goals are, and then just as importantly, um, pointing to um, pointing to examples of it, whether it's a single faculty member who is working on a COVID vaccine, or whether it's a student who has I'll give you one example. A student who decided to create memorial benches in all the schools to honor alumni, mostly women and alumni of color who haven't been honored before, as a way of expanding our sense of history, and who we honor, or a scholarship program for um, local community college students to transfer after 2 years to UVA. And so I think once you can both remind people what the general values are and then point to specific examples, there hasn't been a lot of pushback on that.
Great. Can you talk a little bit about the complexities of being a state institution, but also the particular opportunities and perhaps obligations UVA has to the broader community? You talked a little bit about this relationally, but certainly, right, Virginia is an incredibly diverse state, socioeconomically, racially, has had a fraught history. How do you think about your obligations and responsibilities to the state? And how does this vision enable you to respond to that set of responsibilities?
Yeah, that's a great one. So I guess I'll talk about three things. So first of all, in terms of our obligation to the Commonwealth, which I take seriously, I mean, first and foremost, it's educating Virginians. So we usually admit somewhere between 65 and 70% of our students are in-state. And it's not just doing our best to make sure there are spaces for Virginia students. And, frankly, we don't have enough space for the number of qualified students who would like to attend here. But it's also making sure that economics are not an obstacle, so that any student from Virginia or elsewhere who wants to attend and is admitted won't turn us down because they can't afford it. So we're one of only 2 public universities in the country that's committed to meeting 100% of a student's demonstrated financial need, and which is something that was surprising to me. I didn't know that until I became president, and it started before me. I can't take credit for it. But one of the things we did early on was to also make clear, and this was really picking up on where our financial aid program was heading already, that any Virginia student coming from a family earning less than $30,000 a year would basically come for free. No tuition, no room, no board. And any student coming from a family earning under $80,000 would come tuition free. It really as a way of making it plain what students from families in those income brackets could expect to have to contribute, and making it plain that we want those students to come, and we don't want them to think, I'm not even going to apply because there's no way I'd be able to afford it. So that's one way. Another way is thinking not just about the students, the traditional students who come to UVA, but how can we reach additional students? And the advent of online programs helps that enormously. So we have a School of Continuing Professional Studies that has been really focused on degree completion. So students who have taken some courses, college courses, and have credits but haven't graduated. But we're going to expand what we're doing online quite a bit, and also offering in-person and hybrid programs in Northern Virginia, and really focus on, like I said, the non-traditional student who is looking to advance his or her career or change careers. So thinking not just about degree programs, but also about certificate programs and other credentials that are short of a degree, but useful in the marketplace. And then the last piece I would say in terms of our obligation to the Commonwealth comes in our health system, which is a really important part of the ecosystem of healthcare in the state. And we are fortunate, and I am deeply impressed and grateful to the people who work at our medical center and our medical school and the health system more broadly. And so trying to expand access there, and also, keep doing the life-changing research and life-saving clinical care, I think, is also a critical piece of it.
Great. Can we talk a little bit about free speech and democracy, sort of two spaces that you've been very active in? And maybe first we could talk about your interest in democracy and the role you see universities playing in shoring up our own democracy.
Yeah, I mean, I think universities are a critical piece and always have been. I mean, and UVA has, I think, a distinctive, if not unique, role in the story of our own democracy. I mean, UVA is closely connected to the founding of this country through Thomas Jefferson, and through its initial mission of educating students to become citizen leaders. And at the time when the university was founded, it was actually impossible for any but white male students to attend, obviously, because that was consistent with who was eligible to be a citizen leader. The university also has ties to slavery, and it was enslaved laborers who essentially built the original grounds. The conception of citizen leader has changed over time, thankfully, as has our admissions, so that now anyone is eligible to attend. But I still think it's crucial for universities, and this university in particular, to take seriously what does it mean to prepare students for citizenship. And so some of the ways we do that is by giving students an awful lot of responsibility while they're here. So student self-governance here is, and rightfully so, a cherished tradition, in part because it's connected to preparing students for what we hope will be an engaged life, and engaged in particularly with our democracy. We also created recently the Democracy Institute. So not surprisingly, at UVA, there are a lot of people who are working on different aspects of democracy. And it's a very big topic, and it covers everything from the presidential election to state and local government, and sort of everything in between. And the Democracy Institute that we have already started, we're in the midst of designing a building for it, made possible by a really generous donation from a couple of alumni, is really meant to bring together the various institutes and centers that have been working on different parts of our democracy, so that they'll have a chance to collaborate, and it will be a focal point for our efforts in this field, and meant really to communicate not just internally, but externally. So to work with legislators and policymakers to take a lot of the great ideas that exist at UVA and at other universities and try to get them out into the field, so to speak, so that they'll actually influence what's happening in our world. I'm really excited about it. I wouldn't have thought that it would be as timely as it is now, but with daily stories in just about any newspaper about the fraying of our democracy, it seems especially timely, and even more important than I imagined it would be. And free speech, which I'm happy to talk about, is obviously critical to that.
Yeah, maybe you could talk a little bit about free speech. You've written a couple of pieces on that. How do you think about that in general? How do you think about that in the context of UVA? And
Yeah.
then also in the context, there was a recent Chronicle of Higher Education piece that said presidents do a whole lot of self-censoring. So how free do you feel to speak?
All right, let me take those. Let me take those in turn. So, free speech is obviously a foundational value for any university. It's especially true for public universities because as a public university, we are bound by the First Amendment. But, I wouldn't guess that Notre Dame cares any less about free speech and free inquiry than UVA does, simply because you can't have a robust university. You can't have a robust university without it. So shortly after I started, I got a lot of suggestions, as you do in this job, saying that we should sign on to the Chicago Principles. So the University of Chicago famously adopted a statement on free speech that a number of other universities signed on to. And I thought, well, given UVA's own connection to the First Amendment through both James Madison, who served as rector here, and Thomas Jefferson, who was the founder, we should write our own statement. And we put together a diverse committee that consisted of students, faculty, staff, and alumni. And over the course of 6 or 7 months, they articulated our foundational values. And in addition to just talking about the importance of free speech and free inquiry to the academic exercise and sort of traditional defense, it articulated aspirations. And I think those are as important as any other piece of the statement. And the aspirations are really captured by the lines of trying to cultivate a culture where people are both empathetic speakers and generous listeners. That's not commanded by the First Amendment. The First Amendment protects a lot of nasty speech, but it's really an aspiration that at a university in particular, we should think about not just what we know or believe, but what we don't know. We should try to be empathetic and think about what is the impact of my speech going to have on the audience? What do I not know about the audience that would be really useful to know? What do I not know about someone else's experience? And the idea of generous listening is trying to understand what someone's saying and why they might believe that before jumping to conclusions about their character. And so I think, like I said, that's as important as any other piece of this. And so then the next step becomes, how do you operationalize it? And we can talk a little bit about that if you're interested, because that's as important a piece of this as is just articulating the statement. As for self-censorship of presidents, I think there's self-censorship and there's self-censorship. And by that, I mean, if you feel afraid to say something because you're going to get attacked or criticized, I think that's a negative thing. I think that getting canceled is a bad thing for those who are on the listening end to do, that is to personally attack someone simply because of a view expressed. I also think those who shy away from something simply because someone else is going to disagree with them, some of the times that's on them. And they have to understand that, especially at a university, you're not going to be able to say a lot of things without someone challenging you, and you have to practice that and get good at it. Then there's self-censorship, where it's the polite thing to do, or it's the strategic thing to do. I don't think self-censorship is always a bad thing. So I try to do very little of the former, that is, not say something out of fear. But I do a fair amount of the latter.
Yeah, it sounds like in the latter is consistent with empathetic speaking.
Yeah,
In
exactly
some
right.
sense, right, that's consistent.
Right.
It would be great if you could talk a little bit about, in the context of UVA, how you're operationalizing empathetic speaking and generous listening, because I know many campuses are trying to figure out how does one cultivate
Yeah.
culture and those skills amongst everyone on campus.
Yeah. So, there's no magic wand and there's no silver bullet. So it's a number of discrete efforts. So one of the ways is to talk about free speech at convocation. So one of the very first things students hear from me anyway is about the importance of free speech, but also the importance of empathetic speaking and generous listening. So for the last 2 years since we've had this statement, my convocation speech has been about being curious, not judgmental, which is a quote that's attributed to Walt Whitman, but I think maybe wrongfully attributed to Walt Whitman, but it was then repeated by Ted Lasso, which is why I think a lot of people have heard of it. So that's one way, is it taking the opportunity to speak about it. The other is when there are specific controversies about free speech, going back to the statement and reminding people that, we as a university have endorsed these values. So there was some controversy when the former Vice President Mike Pence was invited to grounds, which is another odd bit of lingo. Instead of calling UVA a campus, we call it the grounds. And being able to refer back to that statement was a really good way of bringing the statement to life and grounding our stance, which was, of course, we should allow the former vice president to speak at UVA. And then I think that set the stage for what was a really great event, insofar as it was a packed house. It was a very civil conversation, and the former vice president opened it up to questions. And you had some pretty hard questions, but all civil. And it was sort of an example of just what we're hoping for. And then there are a bunch of different activities and organizations, all related one way or the other to bringing people who have different views together into conversation. So we've organized a series of conversations called Democracy Dialogues, where we'll bring in high-profile experts on a topic who come at the topic from different perspectives. So it could be our relationship with China, it could be cybersecurity, and then they'll have a moderated conversation. And it's a way, in a sense, to model for the audience what a productive conversation among people with different perspectives can look like. And then there are a lot of student groups that are engaged in similar efforts that we try to support and make more visible than they might otherwise be. So there's one called Sustained Dialogue, where students agree to meet over the course of a semester or a year in relatively small groups and talk about current events, and the groups are intentionally diverse. And there are a host of other examples in that same genre, but that's what I mean when I say there's no silver bullet or magic wand. I mean, in a university with close to 25,000 students, you have to be having these conversations at a lot of different levels, including, I should say, in class. And part of the new college curriculum has a set of courses around engaging with difference. So I should emphasize that this is happening as it should be in the classroom as much as it is outside of the classroom.
Great. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
Can we talk a little bit about COVID? And I realize for many, there's a bit of post-traumatic stress associated with leading during COVID, but you jumped on and COVID was shortly after. When you think about something like great and good, or your own core values and thinking about education, how has COVID, that episode, changed, if at all, your thinking?
Um, it hasn't really changed my thinking. Um, it has underscored some things I already knew or appreciated a little, and made me appreciate them even more. So two things that really jump out. A residential university experience can't be replicated online. And similarly, a university is no place for a pandemic, insofar as it cuts at the core of what we do. And I think that students learn as much outside of the classroom as they do inside of the classroom. And a lot of what they learn is on the good side of the good and great ledger. They learn how to get along with one another. They learn how to engage with people who are different from themselves. They learn how to be good friends. They learn how to trust and to be trustworthy. And that's really hard to do online. And it's really hard to do when you're restricted in how much you can see each other and how much time you can spend with one another. The other thing is, it made me appreciate just how much good there is in this place already. So just to give a few examples, I mentioned the health system earlier. There's no way we would have gotten through this without relying on our health system, and in particular, the expertise of epidemiologists and other medical school professors to help guide our reaction to COVID. And seeing them not only do their regular jobs, plus the increase in activity because of COVID, and then be available whenever we needed them to help us interpret the latest twist and turn with the pandemic and how we should respond, was honestly awe-inspiring. Similarly, with our students and our faculty and our staff, it was a moment where this community really pulled together. There were bumps in the road for sure, but by and large, people remembered maybe the most important thing, which is no one asked for this pandemic. So the question is not who's responsible for this pandemic, but the question is, how can we as a community protect one another and be as close to normal as possible in terms of doing what a university does best? I was just incredibly impressed by how responsible our students were, how creative our faculty were, and how committed and hardworking our staff were, especially in terms of going above and beyond, because a lot of people didn't have to, but they volunteered to do things that weren't part of their job description because they just had to be done. So we didn't have people hired full-time to deliver meals to students who were being quarantined. So we had to figure out how are we going to do that. And we had a lot of staff members volunteer to do everything from deliver meals to help out at testing sites. And so again, going back to the very first question, how do we end up with the idea of being great and good? Well, it's because we were tapping into something that already existed. And sometimes adversity brings out the character of a place. And, I feel more privileged today to be a part of this place than I did before COVID.
Great. Thank you for that. Before we jump to the questions that are queuing up, just one final question. Has being a long distance runner taught you anything about being a good university president? Or are there long distance running skills that are translational?
Um, well, stamina is really important in these jobs, because if you go out too quickly, you can get burned out. Um, that's one. I do think that these jobs are a marathon and not a sprint, which is related. I also think that mental health is really important just generally, but is important in this sort of job. So I run a lot, as much for mental health as I do for physical health. And it's helpful because, it gives me the time to think in an unstructured way. And I would say some of my best ideas and some of my worst ideas have come in the course of a 15-mile run. And when I come back in on Monday, one of the first questions I'm asked if I come with a bunch of ideas is, "You went on a long run this weekend, didn't you?" But the speech that you talked about earlier, that the wait what speech, all of those questions that I talked about in the speech, I thought about over the course of a run.
Great.
So it's really helpful in that respect.
Wonderful. Okay, so questions are teeing up, and the first is from Howard Gardner.
Oh, hi, Howard.
A study that he completed with Wendy Fishman indicates that students think of college in a very self-centered way, focusing on what they're getting out of it, especially whether they can get a job. How do you think we can challenge the assumption that college should only serve the individual and move the needle towards an emphasis on the community and on the good life as you defined it?
Yeah. So first of all, it's great to hear from you at least one step removed. And second, it's a really good question. So a couple of ways I think are emphasizing public service as a value, and not just as a particular career route, and offering students the opportunity to gain skills and experience. And then second, not just encouraging students to get involved in the community, but offering opportunities and also demonstrating as a university that you're involved in the community and that is part of a good life. And so thinking about it not just as a way to, pad a resume, but trying to create actual real experiences where students understand a sense of not just a sense of responsibility or obligation, but a sense of purpose and a sense of joy of being engaged, and a sense of humility, insofar as working outside of the university with the community, you're likely to learn as much as you offer. And I think that's sometimes missing in all of this. But in some ways, it's really about orienting students to look beyond the four walls of the classroom or the four corners of the campus, and getting them to think about the broader world out there, starting by the world that's right outside their doorstep. And again, it's a little bit like free speech. There's no magic wand, and you're not going to catch everyone, but doing as much as you can to provide those opportunities and bringing in people, honestly, to speak about their own lives and how important the totality of their life has been beyond simply what they've done for a career, or if their career has been dedicated to serving others. Hopefully that's a way of broadening horizons a bit.
Great. Next question. Are there any ways that you feel like you have been able to link the idea of being a thriving university with the goal of sustaining democracy in the United States?
Well, yes and no. I think for people who are familiar with universities, and I mean really familiar with universities and not just familiar with a caricature of universities, understand that a thriving university is really important to the health of our democracy at almost every level. We talked earlier about access to education. I think it's really important to our democracy that universities both appear and in fact are accessible to the broadest range of students. I mean, I'm, like I said earlier, a first generation student. And one of the things that we've been focusing on is how do we increase the number and percentage of first generation students? How do we demonstrate that this is an engine for social mobility and it's an engine of opportunity? And then how do we, through our research and our medical care, actually make the world a better place? I think that for those who are, like I said, familiar with universities, the connection is pretty clear. Have we convinced skeptics? I'm not so sure. And in some ways, this is the thing I worry about a lot. I mean, you look at polling data and there's an increasing amount of distrust of universities. And I don't know that we have done a good enough job of explaining why the one is so important to the other. And not just explaining, but demonstrating through the things that we're actually doing to others who might be skeptical that universities are absolutely critical. They're a critical piece of our democracy. And that is the audience, whether it is just the general public or whether it is legislators at the federal, state, or local level, meeting that skepticism, not just with publicity, but with examples of how and why we matter.
Great. You mentioned at the beginning of the conversation, a through line in your work was the notion of access to education. If you reflect on the past 30 years or so, do you think progress has been made on that issue nationally? Or do you think that the challenges are now even greater than they were?
I think some progress has been made. I don't think as much progress as we might have thought 30 years ago or hoped 30 years ago. That's true at the K-12 level. It's also true in higher education. Educational opportunity is still far too closely tied to someone's zip code. And so where someone is born and live often dictates the educational opportunities that they're going to receive at the K-12 level, which then translates to higher education. If you look at the demographics of higher education at the most elite schools, they are still overwhelmingly from the highest income levels, or at least disproportionately from the higher income levels. At the same time, there has been progress on a whole host of things, starting from pre-K, which I actually think is where educational opportunity begins. And so I think one of the brightest spots in terms of educational opportunities, there are far more students in pre-K than were before. And I think that's one of the best investments you can make in education. Going through multiple opportunities for students in school, starting in high school, to think about the path that makes sense to them. And by that, I mean, for a long time, this country has focused, I think, almost too much on a four-year undergraduate degree and not recognize that less than 50% of high school graduates end up in a four-year undergraduate degree program. And it's just sort of this myth that, well, we just need to keep pushing and have more and more students without recognizing that there are a lot of students who are going to community college and there are a lot of students who are not going to go to either, but might need more preparation either in the final couple of years of high school or in some program right after high school. And you're now starting to see attention paid to this, which I think is one of the more exciting developments in education, where students are exposed to different career pathways in high school and exposed to how you could get the experience, knowledge, and credentials you need to follow a particular path. So instead of just pretending that everyone's going to go to a four-year college, recognizing that that is not true for everyone, and while we should create as many opportunities for students for whom that's their chosen path to be able to choose that path, that we don't forget about the students for whom that might not be their chosen path. And that to me is a promising sign, and I hope it continues.
Great. And via wrap up, just one final question. If your life were a book, what would its title be?
I think I've already used the title. Wait, what?
Great. So no editing of the title?
No.
Great.
I have had conversations with friends about titles that I won't repeat here for a sequel to that book, but your imagination might lead you to some variations on Wait, What?
Great. Well, thank you. And with that, I just want to thank you so much for spending this hour with us. Thanks to all the folks who have joined us. And please join us again on October 11th for a conversation with sociology professor Brandon Vayanathan on beauty at work. So Jim, thanks so much. This was
Suzanne,
great.
thank you. Yeah, it was a total pleasure. I really
And-
appreciate your time.
And all the best with all the great and good work you're doing.
Thanks. All right. Take care. Have a
Take
good
care.
day.
Bye-bye.